Cardinal George appeared here on June 26th of 2002 for the first time after returning from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Dallas, where they adopted the zero tolerance policy. As you can see, the attendance, as soon as Jay put this up on the website, it was sold out in about 30 seconds. And I think that was based mainly on the fact that the last time the Cardinal was here, his performance was so strong that people are still talking about it to this day. It's my hope, and I know, Your Eminence, how extremely busy you are, that you would consider making this an annual event. We all know how extremely busy the Cardinal is, but I have to tell you, I myself had no idea until I talked with him about coming for this luncheon, and I started going over his agenda with his assistant. And I realized this is one of the most busy men in the world. I don't know when he finds the time to write the remarks for a day like today. His day starts at 7 o'clock in the morning with Mass in the residence, immediately followed by a working breakfast, then 1 or 2 appointments at the residence and on to the office. Father Flens is looking at this because he works out the schedule. But when he gets to the office, he'll have 6 to 8 appointments a day, a working lunch, comes back to the residence for dinner. If it's dinner there, it's a working dinner, and an evening schedule with 1 or 2 events. Those are the weekdays. Weekends are something entirely different. There are 375 parishes in Chicago. And if he visited one parish a week, it would take him 7 years to cover the Archdiocese of Chicago, just to give you an idea. When he comes back to the residence in the evening after the event, then it's time for him to do the writing and the work, the going through the mail. And as the Cardinal said to me, I pray in the morning and I write in the evening, and I said, I'm glad to see that your priorities are straight. I'm not going to go into the Cardinal's biography, but I really wish that you wouldn't look at it now, but I wish you would take it home with you or back to your office and look through it, and you'll realize what an extremely busy man the Cardinal is. But you'll also realize what a brilliant person he is. And you'll see the stature in which he is held by the Vatican. Cardinal George is a courageous leader. In a time when courage and leadership are in short supply. He's a man of integrity and understanding. If you ask the Cardinal a question, you will get an answer. You will get an honest answer. He will never equivocate. He won't mislead you in any way. If there's such a thing as being honest to a fault, that's the Cardinal. And I find that that's the type of person that people like to deal with. In this day and age of instantaneous media, where we all have our computers on in our office, and we're looking at the internet, and we get a little blurb and sound bites that aren't necessarily always factual, headlines that are meant to get our attention but don't always convey the full story, the Cardinal may not be well served, because the media has to get our attention quickly. But it's not the media's fault, and I'm not here to bash the media. It's our fault, because we don't take the time to read the full story or watch the full program, and we draw conclusions. And that's why it's important to have a forum like the City Club, because the Cardinal can speak to us today in a fair and open setting, get thoughtful and genuine questions, and answer them in a thorough and candid manner. I think we're very fortunate to have the Cardinal here today to do that. There are no shortages of challenges in the Church today. Just to mention a few, and I don't know exactly what the Cardinal will speak on today. I know he'll give us his his views in the state of the church today. But some of the challenges, the loss of confidence in the hierarchy, the abuse scandal, gay marriage, celibacy, women in the priesthood, celibacy, homosexuality in the priesthood, the closing of schools, and the financial problems that go along with all of that. So as I introduced the Cardinal today, I think back to a year and a half ago when I introduced him, and I said the Cardinal was the right man at the half ago when for these challenges. Today, I think that case is even stronger. It's my pleasure to introduce the Archbishop of Chicago, Francis Cardinal George.
I thank you very much for your kind welcome. I thank Tom for the introduction, but I'm not going to speak to all those things today. We'd be here a lot longer than the time allotted permits. I'm grateful for the invitation, a lot longer, to Jay and all the work of others who make this a very important forum for the public conversation in the city and the county and in our area. I thought what I would do is speak to the context of the Catholic Church's life and ministry in the Archdiocese of Chicago, that's Cook and Lake counties, and in the nation in general today, focusing in, first of all, on the context of the sexual abuse scandal, kind of as a postscript to some of the things that Justice Ann Burke spoke to last time. I read her very fine presentation. And then also speak to the context of the Church's mission in the general culture as it is evolving. But that's a big context, and I won't say a lot to it. Instead, I hope to finish early enough so that you can shape this conversation, so that I can get some sense of what you think is important to that topic, and in that sense, we'll all leave better informed. I was ordained a bishop of the Catholic Church in September of 1990 for a small diocese in central Washington state. And therefore, I attended my first meeting of the National Conference of Bishops, which is held every November in Washington, D.C., about 13 and a half years ago. And on the agenda in November of 1990 was the problem of responding to sexual abuse of minors by priests and bishops. This largely, I think, out of the repercussions from the Gautier case in Louisiana in the late 80s. The conference already, before 1990, had set up a committee to address the various facets of what we were beginning to learn. And because there is a regular committee and the agenda of the conference is set by its committees, as is often the case, this has been regularly on the agenda of the National Conference from the time I've been a bishop, and I think for a few years before that. When I joined the conference in 1990, the Chicago protocols were being formed because of the scandal that broke here in the early 90s. And they were worked out, always in conversation with very many people, and so well worked out that they were used as a guideline in formulating national recommendations in 1992. So in 1992, 12 years ago, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops gave 5 recommendations for shaping diocesan policies in the 195 dioceses around the country. The first was that one should respond very promptly to allegations of abuse, take them very seriously. Secondly, if the allegations seem plausible, remove the alleged offender from ministry and get him help. Thirdly, comply with the obligations of civil law about reporting. Fourth, reach out to victims and their families. Fifth, deal as openly as possible with the incident. Those were the recommendations that shaped policy in dioceses from 1992. I know when I went back to Yakima, I knew of only one instance of that in the history of the diocese, but we shaped our policy from those 5 recommendations. Tom mentioned what the press came to call zero tolerance. That is, it wasn't just enough to get a perpetrator help. It would have been determined by a review board that he was in fact guilty in some sense of this crime and this sin. But it was also necessary to remove him entirely from any future public ministry. That was added in 2002 in the Dallas meeting in June because of the reaction to the events in the Archdiocese of Boston. But Boston, too, had in the early 90s set up policies implementing those recommendations, and in fact a good number of priests were removed from public ministry in Boston. In 1993, 14 priests were removed from Boston's public ministry in 1993. Nonetheless, the incidence of serial abusers particularly was there on the record. And so in June 2002, our charter, which is a voluntary charter, because the conference cannot legislate for individual dioceses. Nonetheless, it's effective, and it incorporated most of the elements from the Chicago experience, but it added to that the policy of so-called zero tolerance. When I went to that meeting in Dallas of 2002, I went equipped with a very large volume of information that had been gathered by 19 listening sessions done by the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, for which I'm extremely grateful. What struck me in going through the testimonies that had been gathered by our own Catholic Lawyers Guild was the maturity, even in the midst of great anger, of Chicago's Catholics in the midst of this scandal, perhaps because we had lived with it in a rather open way for 10 years. So that even as a reaction to the terrible events that were now becoming public day after day, every day, on the pages of the Boston Globe and to some extent the New York Times, the people who participated in those 19 listening sessions said, to the number of about a third of them, that the punishment should be nuanced to the crime and that there wasn't a single kind of automatic sentencing necessary. A third. That's a large number of the some thousands of people who participated, and I think it bears witness to the effectiveness of the Chicago protocols that Cardinal Bernardin put into effect with the help of so many others, some of you here today. When I brought that to the other bishops, they said that might work possibly in Chicago because of the experience you've had. It would not work nationally, and the pressure was such that we had to make it very clear that this had to be eradicated to the very heart of it, and therefore we have to go with no reinstatement of any sort. I think now that that probably is right, not only because of public pressures, but also because in studying the cases more carefully, there is a high recidivism rate of 15 to 20%, and you cannot chance that. When you talk to victims, the first thing that they say time after time, no matter what else they say, no matter where they are in their own healing, no matter how free they might be from that terrible incident in their past, the first thing each one says is, please be sure that there is never anyone else who suffers as I have suffered. Never another victim. And the only way to be sure of that, if there is a recidivism rate that high, is to take someone out of public ministry entirely. The difficulty is that in the Church's law, in order to inflict that kind of permanent penalty on someone, including a priest, you have to use something more than administrative means. You have to use a juridical process, a trial, or something that is a forum which permits everyone's rights to be respected and everyone to have his or her say. And so, complementary to the Charter, we with the help of the Holy See, put together norms which are canonical and therefore are not voluntary but have the force of law. This was badly interpreted as a weakening of the charter when in fact it was a strengthening of the charter, because it was the only way that we could keep the promise of the charter to remove permanently from any public ministry any priest who has this in his background at any time. Those norms are in effect now, and they're being worked through, and in fact various canonical trials are being held, and there are various other instruments of the law, the Church's law, to handle this that are possible now as a response in law to the promises of the voluntary charter. The Church has her own law, which of course is itself a subject of some dispute. The Reformation turned on that point, whether or not there should be a canon law separate from civil law, or whether the civil law simply must obtain entirely over all the actions of the Church. But the Church is a public institution with a long history. She's not a tyranny. Those of us who have authority to govern in the Church have not governed according to the law, nor is she a spiritual club where the members can redo the law from time to time depending upon the pressures upon them or their own inclinations. Authority in the Church, according to our faith, comes not from the people, but from Jesus Christ himself. Given to the apostles, it is then handed on to their successors in the apostolic college. But that authority has to be exercised for the good of the believers, for their unity around Christ, according to the laws of the Church. That means, however, that people cannot be removed from office at will. For an office, an ecclesiastical office, is not a job, it's not a profession. It is an office which brings with it responsibilities and also certain rights, so that removal depends upon showing cause. For example, if the Pope wants to remove me as the Archbishop of Chicago, he has to show cause, and he has to bring me before a church court and make the case of why I am derelict in my obligations or personally corrupt, and therefore, according to law, can be removed. So those systems of rights and obligations are attendant to offices of the episcopacy, of the priesthood, of deacons, and also some lay officials. Tom Brennan is here. He has a 5-year term as the CFO of the Archdiocese of Chicago. I can't just fire him. I would have to, because he's protected in canon law, precisely in order to protect him from a nutty bishop, in such a way that the bishop has to take him to a trial if he wants to remove him. Of course, there are other ways to make his life miserable, as he can tell you. So we're talking about offices and not just jobs, and therefore that complicates something, and that isn't always well understood. But it means that we needed juridical norms and not just a charter, which was voluntary. The charter itself called for audits, one particular, and two, because it's a 2-year charter to be revised and renewed as we come closer to the 2nd anniversary of June 2002 and the Dallas meeting. It called for an audit to see if the procedures of the dioceses and eparchies of this country are in fact in compliance with the regulations of the charter itself. And then it also called for a statistical study, because there is no database for understanding this phenomenon, neither in the Church nor anywhere else. And all of those studies and that audit were overseen by the National Review Board, which demanded, as I think Ann Burke explained last time, an enormous amount of generosity in time and in effort and in working through a great deal of difficulty, not only because of the Church's own mission and her self-understanding, but also because you had some very, very high-powered people who had to come to work together and to address this, and did so because of their love of the Lord and of his Church. And we owe a great deal of gratitude, certainly to Ann Burke, who assumed the chairmanship of this committee at a time when it was in crisis, and has brought it through in such a way that the report that they gave to complement the statistics, and it's just a preliminary report, I think phrases the problem very well and presents the problems in such a way that are capable of solution within the context of the Church's own faith and also of the culture in which we live. We owe a great deal of gratitude to Justice Ann Burke and those who worked with her. Besides the National Review Board, there is also within the structure of the conference itself the Office for the Protection of Children and Young People, headed up right now by Kathleen McChesney, who many of you know. And they had the responsibility for seeing to the audits and will continue to have that, even as the bishops have to rethink this whole situation to see what are the structures that we need to move forward. Elements of this will certainly remain permanent, but the way in which we move forward once we have what we have now is going to be different, I think, from what we've done up to this point. That is, obviously, having this statistical data, there has to be something other than the National Review Board's commentary on it. There must be some scientific study of it, and so we have to, in order to come to a sense of causes, go on and do a great deal of more work just using the statistical database. And the norms themselves now have to be re-examined, particularly to see what the Holy See itself, in the light of our experience, wants to incorporate permanently into the Code of Canon Law and what she doesn't. The goals of all this are several. First of all, to reach out to victims. Chicago has had, for over a dozen years, a very, very fine and highly developed victims assistance ministry. You can see what that does in the handout you've been given, entitled Office of Professional Responsibility. This is widely distributed so that people will know whom to call, what to do if they have an allegation, and how the process unfolds. That's been a continuous effort, and those who have been most involved with it, John O'Malley certainly, who is here, could tell you how it has evolved over the years. I have nothing but the highest admiration for those who are involved in this, and I know the seriousness with which they take it and work through it. The idea, of course, here is healing. Healing isn't possible until one can be free, and freedom isn't possible until one can forgive. But the dynamics of forgiveness have to be respected in each and every individual case. And that's where the perpetrator has something to do with the freeing of the victim by asking for forgiveness. The bishops have asked collectively for forgiveness, but it means a great deal if the perpetrator himself is able to do that. That means the perpetrator himself is through denying and going through a series of processes. It means he himself is free enough to recognize the horror of what he's done. That's the second goal, after reaching out to victims, to assure that there are regular procedures so that everyone's rights are respected, so that complaints can be handled in a just and systematic fashion, and there are sometimes problems in doing that, so that cases can be settled, and so that the civil authorities can be notified. That's been done here for well over a dozen years, and the relationship to the civil authorities is one of mutual trust. Thirdly, besides reaching out to victims and being sure that the procedures are fair and just and are the same for all, we have the larger problem of the church's own context. That is, how do we see that there is a safe environment for children? And here the Archdiocese has done safe and more in recent years because of the Dallas Charter. We use the Virtus training program. I've gone through the training to try to recognize signs of abuse children. Each of us has had a background check. That's about 50,000 people, employees and volunteers working for the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago, myself included. I'm glad to say that my background is clear, and you can check it on the website if you want to be sure of that. The, I think, perspective of the Virtus program has lifted the onus of from the children to adults. That is, many programs are designed to train children to recognize something is wrong when they are in fact being abused. This program shifts from that to the adult, saying that the onus is on every single adult to protect every single child, and you're trained to own how to do that, so that it isn't just for the children themselves to bring something forward, but for adults to protect the children and, if necessary, bring an allegation forward. The objection is often raised that what's missing from all of this is the bishop's own role. In fact, any bishop who is accused of sexually abusing a minor himself goes exactly under the same protocols as a priest or a deacon and is removed. But what about the faults of oversight, of ineffective oversight? I think Ann Burke spoke to this last time. The National Review Board spoke to it in terms of fraternal correction. which is built in to some extent, but which is now being strengthened. So, for example, the bishops of the province of Chicago, which is the whole state of Illinois, each time we get together now twice a year, this is the first item on our agenda. How are you handling the cases? What are you doing? What is going on our agenda to happen? That wasn't true 2 years ago. And it's also a question that comes up informally in many bishops' meetings. The difficulty is to discover or to process and to think through the cases of bishops who, having done what was the usual process in the 70s and 80s, taken someone out if the allegation proves to be true, especially now using an independent review board to do that, getting him help, and then very often they put him back. Cardinal Bernardine did that. Sometimes monitored, sometimes not adequately. But then when there is a recidivism incident, if that happens again, to continue. Take him out and then put him back, take him out, if that happens. There are 149 such cases in the national statistics from the John Jay College report. And I've talked to Kathleen McChesney. It would be interesting to try to find out when and where, and the when at least is possible to be discovered. And they're looking at those 149 cases to see exactly how we might discover which bishops might have been involved in that kind of behavior. I would hazard a guess that I suspect there are fewer than 15 or 16. When you look at the times of the incidents, when you look at the time, particularly when you look at the abuse, it's pretty much exhausted by the end of the 80s. And you take a look at the time that bishops have served, I suspect there wouldn't be too many bishops still in office who have been guilty of that. But we should try to follow up on that, and we will, and the bishops themselves are willing to do that. Always within the context, however, and the law of the church and the protections of an office that is necessary for the stability of the church. Having said that, that's a bishop's perspective on, and this bishop's perspective on where we are. That is certainly one part of the context that shapes the Catholic Church's life and ministry in our country today. It's not the total context, however. There's a much larger cultural in our country, and I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about that because that's a very big topic. But I'd like to mention it and then open the floor for your considerations. In 1992, as the Boston cases became public, most of the op-ed pieces, especially in the New York Times, spoke about the sin of the priests and how it was necessary to remove priests from office who have been guilty of this and to listen more, remove the victims, all of that good advice. The op-ed pieces shifted rather quickly to say it isn't so much the priests that deserve the anger of the people, it's the bishops. And what will suffer from this is the confidence and the trust and perhaps the authority of bishops themselves. A couple of years later, the op-ed pieces were titled, How Roman Are American Catholics? And that it was unity with Rome itself that now had to be considered. This criticism of a church that claims authority from Christ and teaches even absolute truth in his names is something that has been heard for a long time, from the colonial times, in fact, in the United States of America. And it means that the Catholic Church always, but particularly now because of the scandal and the terrible shame of the sexual abuse of minors, has to go very carefully as she finds her way minors this culture. Perhaps less so in Chicago, which has always been something of a Catholic center, very clearly so in parts of the South and the West, but everywhere there are particular problems. Some of them are problems endemic to the nature of religion itself, particularly a religion that teaches in our kind of social contract society. That is, from the time of the Enlightenment, and we are an Enlightenment society, religion has been seen as a threat to personal freedom, because if religion is all-powerful, then how am I able to lead my own life as I want to? And so the Enlightenment thinkers were either atheists or agnostics, but were very clear that God is not an actor in human affairs. God's work, if there is a God, is entirely our own. And therefore religious authority should have no say in human affairs unless an individual wants to let that authority in. That idea that religion is in some way suspect, or at least has to be carefully contained, because it's in some way to personal freedom, and personal freedom is our most important value. Americans kill to be free. We do it all the time. That remains a very dominant dimension of the context of the church's ministry. To that suspicion that the church is in some sense against human freedom is now, since 9/11, added the more than suspicion that dogmatic religions are an occasion of violence. They're a threat not only to freedom, they're a threat to peace. And they're there too, if you read the op-ed pieces in Peace, New York Times particularly, you can see that very clear. It's not only Islam that has to give up its doctrinaire ways, so must the Catholic Church. However, there are, within that cultural context, which is pretty constant over our history, nonetheless huge pockets where the church has flourished and has been very successful, in fact, in implementing her mission. In this archdiocese, much of the effort and the resources of the church has been taken up in welcoming immigrants who are Catholic already, and through our own institutions teaching them how to be Catholics in America. That's been extraordinarily successful. Never was it presumed that there would be a conflict between being Catholic and being American. Certainly not when I was growing up here. Our readers in my parochial school were part of something called a faith and freedom series, the assumption being that Catholic faith and American freedom walked hand in hand without conflict. That assumption is a bit naive. However, it certainly shaped me, and it shaped many others, including many of you here. Now, as we enter into a new moment, both in the evolution of the general culture, which is more aggressively secularist than it was 40, 50 years ago, and a new moment in the Catholic Church, weakened as she is because of this scandal, we will see what the future bears. I thank you very much for your attention, and now if you'd like to raise some questions, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them.
Hi, Larry Horace. I'd like to go on a little different subject. There's been a lot of talk about chastising politicians or taking them out of the membership of the church, denying communion, for not following the basic tenets of the church, either on abortion or gay rights. Could you comment on the appropriateness of the church to do that? Should it do it? Or maybe on what basis would it argue that the church should not do it to protect its principle?
Thank you. We have a committee working on that problem, headed by Cardinal McCarrick, the Archbishop of Washington. There's a lot that could be said to that, and I don't have a completely satisfactory answer. One way you won't find the answer is through making it a church-state problem. It's very clear that there's an institutional distinction between church and state in this country, and the document on the church in the contemporary world from the Second Vatican Council espouses that kind of distinction without necessarily espousing all the elements of separation in the American constitutional order as it's evolved in the last 50 years. But I had something else here, and it just happens that there is a quote that from Gaudium et Spes, that document I mentioned. The political community and the church are autonomous and independent of each other in their own fields. Nevertheless, both are devoted to the personal vocation of man in the generic sense, the human being, though under different titles. The church should have the true freedom to proclaim her teaching about society, to carry out her task among people without hindrance, and to pass moral judgment even in matters relating to politics whenever the fundamental rights of man or the salvation of souls requires it. For this understanding of the relationship between the demands of faith and the obligations of citizenship to be effective, religious institutions must be free even of state interference to pursue their own mission, cooperating with the state and, where necessary, criticizing it. And vice versa, of course. The point is that in the last 500 years, believers have been citizens of nation states. They were always citizens of some kind of civic order, but that means that the believer is a citizen and so is called to contribute to the nation and to work for the common good, including as elected officials in a democracy. But the citizen is also a believer. So he or she is called to witness to Jesus Christ, not only in the church, but also in society at large. She is called, in other words, this isn't a church-state issue, it's a faith-life issue. And therefore it's a matter of the personal integrity of each believer. The faith is the faith, which means it's total. It isn't that if God is all-powerful, then he has something to say to all the dimensions of our experience, not as a cosmic spy, but as someone who gives us our being, gives us our life, and gives us our freedom. Christ died to make us free. But it's a particular kind of freedom that has to be worked out socially for the common good, but it's religiously according to God's own will for us, which is for our own benefit, for our eternal salvation. So our sense of freedom isn't just a matter of personal choice. It's something far deeper, far more profound than that. It constitutes us. It isn't something added to our being. The faith speaks to all dimensions of our being, or else it's not faith. The faith is something else. And that means, since it speaks to all dimensions of life, it speaks also to political life and economic life, particularly where you get into moral orders. Not so much the vision of faith, who is Jesus Christ, who is God, but rather what is God's will and what are the commandments of God and how do they synchronize with the dictates, laws of the state. So because both faith tells us do this and don't do that, and the civil authority tells us do this and don't do that, and the culture tells us do this and don't do that, from rules of etiquette to things, there is always the possibility of conflict between two normative systems. We all live with that, and we always will. The problem that you're raising is how do we work it out individually, and particularly how do you work it out when you are a public figure? That depends on several things. First of all, it depends on how far the state encroaches upon areas that are not the state's business. We live in a democracy that has a limited government, and there are to be limited democracies in the reach of the state. So the things that are most important to our existence as human beings are not the business of the state. The nature of life itself, the nature of marriage, the nature of faith, to use just three examples. Those are all things that predate the state or any kind of constitutional order, and the state has no right to tell us what they are, to define them. The state has the right to qualify them, to show us how we have to live in those institutions, but it has to be very careful as how to reach into the very nature of those institutions, or it becomes not a limited state, but a totalitarian dictatorship. The elements of creating such a dictatorship are here in many ways, particularly through the courts now that aren't limited even by their own precedents. And so we have the possibility of becoming a prison of our own making, a democratic prison, one we might choose. Hitler was elected, after all, but one which nonetheless is a real possibility. Against that possibility, there is the conscience of the lawgivers themselves. There is the teaching of various religious institutions that predate the state. There is the whole history and experience of the human race itself. And that depends upon our memory and depends upon many things as we bring it forward. That's the general context. When you get to a particular elected official, what he or she has to do is to say, how is it that my faith, which permeates every dimension of my life, including the political and economic orders, going to work itself out in such a way that I can, in conscience, serve in this capacity? You go back to John Kennedy, who made it very clear in order to get elected that the church was not going to tell him what to do, and that's fine, it shouldn't. But he also said very clearly that if there ever came a moment when in his conscience he couldn't put together the demands of public office and the teachings of his own faith, he would have the courage to resign. That's a rather extreme solution, but I think that's where it belongs. It belongs in the choice of the office holder himself or herself. It belongs, if they're people of integrity, to them to try to work that out. And then it belongs to the bishops to say you worked it out well or you didn't. And how you say that, respectful of everyone, respectful of everyone's obligations, is something that I don't have a good answer for. But I think the question has to be posed in that order. Not church-state, but faith-life. And there every believer, particularly every disciple of Jesus Christ, who is a disciple within the context of the church that Christ left behind, has to try to work that out with his spiritual director, with his confessor, and also in some sense, I suppose, if it becomes too public, with his bishop. Not liking public controversy myself, I'm loath to say that we should take too many public positions on this at this point. Nonetheless, there is a certain scandal here, and we hear from a lot of Catholics that they are scandalized. That depends upon them, too, to choose to be scandalized. Just a last note on that, it's very interesting that when John Kennedy was elected, he was the first man I ever voted for, because the first time I could vote, I was old enough to vote, there was a great concern about whether or not the church was going to influence him in any way that was not constitutionally correct. With John Kerry being the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party, that issue isn't raised at all. Does that say something about the difference between Kennedy and Kerry? I think it says something far more about the difference between where we were 40 years ago and where we are today.
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer of Public Affairs, airing every Monday night at 8:30 on Channel 21. CAN TV. And indeed,
yeah, CAN TV, okay. Yeah.
I can't resist the next one. In the next week and a half, the City Club of Chicago's very own Paul Green will be our guest. Your Eminence, let me see if I can apply what you've just said or narrow it to some edicts or directives from the church and how...
You don't give edicts. Again, we're governed by the Code of Canon Law. You can't excommunicate somebody because they vote for something.
Okay.
It's very clear.
No, I'm not...
You know, so there are some penalties you can't impose. We have to govern by law. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Paul
Sometimes people say
issues the
excommunicate. You're the one that brought that up. Excommunicate.
All right.
Believe me, it's very, very narrow, that power. Very, very narrow.
But Your Eminence, last fall, I believe, the Pope issued a doctrinal note. And as you know, that note dealt with when political activity runs up against moral principles that do not admit of exception or compromise or derogation, well, then certain things kick in. Now, the last part is my words, not the note, obviously. But the note goes on, as you know, to talk about abortion and talk about the protection of life from conception to death. And now, as you know, the Bishop of Scranton, apparently in response to that, has issued, if not an edict, perhaps a directive that those individuals in that diocese who are pro-choice, or some would say pro-abortion, would be barred from using the churches in that area, dioceses, from speaking. That is, they could not publicly speak in that area, and that would assume, although I don't know that the director said, with particular application to politicians who would be, of course, publicly pro-choice, pro-abortion. And my understanding is, similarly, in the Bishop of Eau Claire and now of New Orleans has issued for, again, those individuals in those areas that are described as pro-choice or pro-abortion, they would be barred from receiving communion. So I'm wondering, are you, in this area, in your diocese, considering issuing a similar directive that would bar certain activities from individuals with respect to receiving communion or being able to speak? And if not, why not?
Well, not at this point, no. I mean, it would be very interesting to toss it out and say, what do you think? I've done that at the Presbyteral Council. I've done that at the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, which is 60 lay people. I've done that at the Archdiocesan Women's Committee, which is about 20 lay women. You know, before a bishop moves, he'd better listen a lot. He'd better consult, particularly on something which is political, because political issues of their nature divide, and the bishop has to be a source of unity. So I'm not going to do this tomorrow or the next day, but we have this committee I'm talking about, which is examining all the options. This is one of the reasons why, at least in the Catholic Church, we don't let politicians take pulpits, because politics divide, and the church is supposed to be about uniting people, as long as the parameters of the faith and the moral code are respected. The problem is compounded because the Pope, in the document you mentioned, has said, look, legislators and politicians have to respect the law as it is. But then if the laws seem unjust, for example, they permit killing of infants in the womb, then you have to work towards changing them. But while they're in force, they're enforced, including by Catholic officials. The difficulty is of saying working toward. Let me turn that around. It's an example often used. Governor Mari Cuomo argues very differently around abortion from what he does around the death penalty. In the case of the death penalty, he knew very well that his constituents in the majority were not for it. Yet he didn't say, well, because they're not for it, therefore I can't be for it. He said we have to work in order to do away with the death penalty. So he enforced the death penalty as governor of New York State, but in fact he worked to try to abrogate it. What we have now around abortion is not just that attitude. Well, we have the abortion laws, and we will work to try to protect fetal life as much as we can while enforcing the laws as long as they're in effect. What we have is the association of a right to abortion with freedom, which is our dominant value. Once you do that, that a woman isn't free unless she has the right to abort a child, then you're into another kind of moral discourse. You can't possibly, because freedom is such an absolute good in our culture, argue against abortion. And in fact, the great scandal, to my mind, of the Democratic Party is that there's no pro-life caucus, none whatsoever, a party that historically has been concerned about the weakest among us, why most Catholics were, in fact, Democrats historically, doesn't permit any freedom of speech around this question of abortion. At the State of the Union address, the only time when all the Democrats remained seated when the president presented his various issues was precisely around the issue of abortion, particularly the killing of children as they leave the womb. So in that particular situation, there is something of a scandal. One can say, as I have, that the Democratic Party has lost its soul. One could also argue that the Republican Party never had a soul. But that's called equal opportunity. And, but there is something
fair and balanced.
There is something seriously wrong with a country that has watched over 40 million infants be killed in the last 30-some years. And it should be a matter of some concern. So the fact that it can't be a concern, that it simply has to be put aside and never discussed publicly again, even by the oldest of our political parties, is a matter of concern. I think politically, it's also a matter of concern morally for the people who espouse that, and it's precisely as their pastors and their concern for them that bishops speak. At the same time, in speaking with them myself, these are people of sophisticated moral habits and, in my experience, deep moral concerns. And so to put it just pro, contra, good guys, bad guys is a mistake all the way around. That's why I wanted to move it from church-state, because that gets into all kinds of things that aren't helpful, into this question of personal integrity and faith and life. At this point, the integrity of my office doesn't demand that I do what you asked. If, in fact, it did, and I couldn't, I would resign. And so, if the Pope lets me. So this is a matter of the utmost concern, but I don't have a clear answer to your question at this time.
But that issue is before the committee that you referred to, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Your Eminence.
Virginia Mann, and
Yes, Virginia.
Father, like you, I am a product of Catholic education. I've had 16 years of Catholic schooling here in the Chicago area. And my biggest concern right now is, despite the fact that I disagree with a lot of the positions of the Catholic Church, I am a very strong supporter of Catholic education. I think the Catholic community has done a tremendous job in educating the children of the area and continues to, but seems to be at greater risk than ever before. What can we do as citizens to help make certain that that option is available for people throughout the city, not only Catholics, but people of all faiths, so that they have an opportunity to provide their children with an excellent education?
Elect a different legislature. No, that's too glib and too perhaps unfair, but not entirely. The problem of maintaining, coincidentally, choice in parental decisions about their child's education depends upon finding ways to fund more adequately a system that works, and the statistics are there to show it, but is seriously underfunded. As I mentioned once before, I think in this forum, the biggest part of our problem is that, like any budget, salaries take up the vast majority of our funds, and we didn't have to worry about that when you had women vowed to poverty who were the teachers, and that was their mission, and they were happy in doing it. But that's not the case now, and so you have to try to give some kind of just salary, and that isn't going to be possible, I believe, indefinitely at least, unless there is some way of finding, whether through tax credits or some other means — voucher is a bad word, so I won't use it — a way to enable parents to make that choice. It's complicated also by the fact that historically the public schools were supported by taxes, and I certainly think that the system of taxation that supports the public schools has to be looked at, because it seems to me to be unfair. I support that. But that private monies, foundations and businesses, etc., were there for requests from private and parochial educators. Now the public system is asking for support from the private sector, and so that money is all the harder to get. There are just a number of problems here, and I think that there are a good number of people working on it, but basically it's politically impossible, I'm told, at this state, even though it's constitutionally permissible, politically impossible for different reasons, and you can fill it better than I the reasons, to get such a program, a hearing at this time in Springfield. I've talked to a number of people about it, including the governor, and especially at this time when the state budget is in such serious disarray, this is not the opportune moment to raise that, but we're going to try to see if we can't get at least a discussion about a pilot program in the very poorest of the schools in the areas where they are. There is federal money for that comes to us through the good graces of the Chicago public school system for the city of Chicago. They're the conduit through which it comes to us. We're very grateful for their cooperation. But the fundamental injustice of educating our children is there, and it has nothing to do with democracy. Every other Western democracy in the world is able to find ways to fund Catholic schools. So I would just ask you to continue to keep that issue in the front of your mind as you vote. And again, it's not a one-way, one issue that's predominant. There are many others that are more important, perhaps, in some ways to individuals. But that's what I see it as. We have done all we can. The Big Shoulders Fund is enormously helpful. The Archdiocese, besides the stipends and the subsidies from parishes, the Archdiocese gives $6 to $8 million every year in subsidies to the poorer schools. The Big Shoulders gives a lot of scholarships and other subsidies and makes capital improvements possible, but it still is a stretch that becomes harder and harder to make. So I would just encourage you to help us think through how we might do it if Catholic school education means that much to you. As far as you're disagreeing with the church, I mean, that's fine. In the end, you don't answer to me, it doesn't. No, if you're a Catholic, in the end, you'll be before Christ, and you have to figure out what you'll tell him. I have an obligation to teach, and when I'm before Christ in a very few years, he'll ask me, what did you teach, and how did you try to make the Catholics of Cook and Lake County holy? And so your holiness, in a sense, I'm held hostage to. If you don't make it, I'm going to have a harder time making it.
And it's probably too broad a question, but in regard to the future of the Catholic Church, RCIA programs of the future, catechumenate program, the charge from the, and I'll probably say it wrong, Divino Plante Spiritu to all the way to Dei Verbum, has that charge been heard yet? In regard to the impetus to the people, that kind of thing, that the way the Bible's taught.
Divino Plante Spiritu is Pius XII's encyclical on Scripture that opened up scriptural biblical criticism in Catholic scholarly circles, and Verbum Dei, Dei Verbum, is the Constitution on Divine Revelation from the Second Vatican Council, which also talked about Scripture. And your question is?
Well, just, I'm in a diaconate program right now, actually, with the other side, Joliet Diocese.
Okay.
But hopefully, you won't hold
Good,
that against
yeah,
me.
you mentioned that.
Just in regard to the way I was taught, or as a Catholic, simple things like Adam and Eve were real people, but basically it's a really good story about freedom and responsibility. Just things like that. How is that shaping for the future?
Whew. How much time do we have left here?
Yeah.
First of all,
I can talk to you later.
if there's a unity of the human race, and Humani Jainism teaches that, then there had to be an original couple of some sort anyways, whatever their names were. And how that relates to the evolution of the human species, et cetera, those are complicated questions. How they relate to the study, the stories, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are stories. After that, with the introduction of Abraham in the 11th chapter, you start getting into history or prehistory. That doesn't mean the stories aren't true, however. And the exact nature of that truth is something that shifts. You go back to the constant teaching of the church. The teachers in the church are the bishops and those in communion with them. You listen to another kind of teaching that comes from the academy, and you listen very carefully. But you listen also with the sense that what one generation of scholars asserts, the next generation of scholars is going to deny, particularly when it's not in the physical sciences, when you don't have that kind of empirical evidence. And so you have to, right now we're working through a whole lot of criticism, of biblical criticism. So you have to be aware of what happened in Germany in the 19th century, which was responsible for a split in Protestantism between those who held the fundamentals and those who admitted higher biblical criticism on the other side. That split between conservative and liberal Protestantism hasn't been quite as acutely felt in the Catholic Church because the teachers finally aren't professors, they're finally pastors, they're bishops. And nonetheless, it's there. However, that very split is now being healed in fundamental Protestantism by going back to the fathers of the church and seeing how their early interpretations weren't exactly what 19th century German scholars said, nonetheless inform our understanding of Scripture still. That kind of memory is held in the Catholic Church, particularly through the liturgy and its readings. And the very methodological limitations of historical criticism are now being discussed. In other words, if you adopt a method, and the method will say you exclude everything except this, then that's your answer. That's true in the physical scientists. But the methodology excludes any kind of spiritual influence, any kind of spiritual power. Spirit doesn't have power in a materialist science. It's not supposed to. It's not a variable you have to take into account. So some of that kind of methodological narrowness attends to modern historical biblical criticism. What you can see is what the method will allow you to see. So now there's a critique of the methodologies themselves and a return to something of an earlier system of theological discourse on Scripture. So the answer to your question is the Church tells us that God made us intelligent and we're supposed to use our intelligence, including using our intelligence to study Scripture. But in the Church, Scripture is a witness to something else. In other words, Jesus came, he did something, he died, he rose, and he left behind not a book, he never wrote one. He left behind a community, which became his church, which wrote the book and tells us this is God's word, and this other gospel, written in somebody else's name, is not. How does the church know that? Because the church knows her Lord. Through the power of the Spirit, the Lord remains in the church and enables the church to discern as she goes through human experience what is from God and what is not. Scripture is from God because it's inspired, but it's the church that tells us it's inspired, and it's the text that has to be read to be understood in the context of the church. And in that context of the bishops and the scholars and you and everybody else keep reflecting, and we're slow to make final judgments about this theory isn't good, this theory is okay, but judgments come, but slowly you need a lot of reflection. Thank you for being part of a deacon formation program, and I hope you get that kind of immersion in God's holy word as you go through towards ordination.
Thank you.